order. May I extend a very warm welcome today to Joe Shanmugalingam, if I pronounced it right. Warm welcome to you. I think you've been before this committee before.
Yeah.
And you were the second permanent secretary at DFT since May 2023. On your left, my right, Nick Shaw, who is the joint head of the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles for the department, and you've been joint head of OZEF since July 2022. But I think it's your first appearance before this committee, is that right? Well, a special warm welcome to you. We're not as fearsome as our reputation, but we can have teeth if we need to. And finally, by no means least, Richard Bruce, who's the Director of Transport of Decarbonisation of the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles at the Department of Transport. So welcome to all three of you. So welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 20th of January 2025. The UK's domestic transport sector amounted for almost 30% of greenhouse gases in 2023. To tackle this issue, the government has committed to phasing out new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, with all new cars and vans being sold zero emission from 2035, just 10 years away. Critical to meeting this target is the adequate availability and reliability of charge points for electric vehicles in order for drivers to have confidence in the journeys that they're taking. The government appears to be on track to meet the minimum 300,000 charge points that the department estimate is needed by 2030. However, questions have been raised regarding the geographical disparities in the availabilities of these EV charge points across the UK, with London and the South East having 44% of all public transport charge points, where rural areas only have 15%. The accessibility of public charge points for disabled users is another key issue that the government must address to continue the uptake of electric vehicles, as well as ensuring that sufficient funds are available to local authorities to install public charging infrastructure. So, we will be questioning our witnesses on all of these issues today. But before we get into that, Permanent Secretary, I did, actually, I'm afraid, very much short notice, but I don't know what you're able to tell me about this question. I am perfectly happy, given it was such short notice, if you can't tell me anything, to write to me. The only thing I would say is, please, could we have all the information? So the question is this. In relation to the back tunnel of HS2, could you give us the total cost, the most up-to-date total cost, including the cost with the joint venture EKTB, the land purchasing costs, the Highways England fee, and any other costs?
Thank you. I don't have that information with us today, but we will certainly write to you, and I know you want the information really quickly, so we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can.
We would appreciate that, because our report,
with your report
on
from
HS2
the pre-Christmas hearing. Understood.
Is pending, and we would like to possibly, depending on your answer, get something in on that.
Understood.
So that's
we will
really
come back
helpful.
To you.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think this is a question for Mr. Shaw. Amongst the written evidence that we've had has been evidence submitted by the National Fire Chiefs Council, and it reflects a conversation I had last year with the head of my local fire station in Richmond about electric vehicle fires. And I was really alarmed by what I was told. We'd had a recent electric vehicle fire which took, I think, 3 days to put out. And had to have a firefighter with it the whole time. And there are specific risks associated with electric vehicle fires, which has been very much highlighted by this written evidence. So I'm interested to know, what is your team doing about electric vehicle fires, ensuring that the fire service have the resources that they need, and also the specific issue raised in this evidence about vast amounts of water are needed to put out electric vehicle fires, which then becomes contaminated. What arrangements are being made to deal with that wastewater?
I think if it's all right, actually, Richard is probably best placed to answer, if that's
yes,
all right.
Yes, no, that's fine.
Yeah, very happy to try and answer that. And if we can't give you all the detail now, then we'll have to write and sort of follow up. I think the first point to make is there's no evidence that we can see that electric vehicles have any higher propensity to burst into flames than combustion engine vehicles.
That's fine. It's more when they do.
When they do,
the impact is much greater than with
it's a different sort of fire. It
diesel
requires
vehicles.
different techniques to put out. And we've been working with the fire brigades about the best technique for that and working out a handbook for how you would deal with particular EV fires, what the best techniques are. Some fire brigades are developing their own techniques involving containers they put the vehicle into, they take it away, but there isn't a standard approach yet, and I think it's quite right that they try and agree the best practice. So why don't we give you sort of chapter and verse in writing on this particular issue, which I think is probably the best way of doing it.
I'd welcome that, thank
That's
you.
very helpful. Thank you very much. We now turn to Nestle Calliscombe, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for joining. My first question is about local authorities. So as of October 2024, I understand there's about £240 million has been spent to support the delivery of electric vehicle points, and local authorities are at the forefront of seeing those be delivered in communities. My first question is about procurement and frameworks that may or may not exist. There are challenges with frameworks, is what my understanding is. There were efforts to create a framework, but because of competition law, those frameworks that councils would seek to use weren't appropriate. I wondered if you might be able to provide us with an update on that and any detail of where we are with possible frameworks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will start and then Nick will be able to add further detail. The first thing to say is that we have really learnt the lessons of the previous schemes, the on-road charge point scheme, and actually the previous work of the NAO and this committee in 2021, which reminded us of the importance of working with local authorities on the design of the scheme. And I think we are really seeing it, and we were welcomed the NAO's assessment of that in how the local electricity vehicle infrastructure scheme has been designed and is rolling out, and the sort of absolute importance of this being something that local authorities can work with because they best understand the needs of their communities. On procurement, the local authorities are the sort of contracting authorities. Ultimately, the judgments are for them to make. Again, one of the lessons we learnt, though, was that we can provide support on guidance, template documents. A particular issue did arise, as you say, and a number of local authorities decided they needed to change the approach they were going to make, and that has meant some delays. But I think all now have a route to market. And Nick, I don't think you want to add.
Joe's entirely right. So I think all projects have a route to market, I think is the point as of now. So the issue that we saw last year has kind of dissipated somewhat. A number were planning to use frameworks as you describe, and a particular framework provider got legal advice for themselves that their framework was not in line with procurement regulations, and they took the decision to take that product off the market. And what we did for those local authorities that were looking to use that sort of framework, and using that particular framework in particular, we provided lots of short-term advice, so around the different routes to market they could take, so using more open procurement. But also over time as well, we've looked to try and replicate some of the benefits of using a framework, so providing that kind of template documentation, and so really helping local authorities through this.
Okay, because that was going to be my second question, which is what sort of support are you providing to local authorities? Because when we look at a map as to where electric vehicles have been delivered, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of them are in south of the country, particularly in London, where there is a pan-London approach sometimes and support from mayoral authorities, for instance. For other small local authorities, that support, particularly around procurement, could be a challenge. And so I welcome what you've said. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more about the support.
I just thought generally, first of all, say we really agree, like the distribution of public charge points is not even across the country at the moment, and it really reflects two different market forces. First, where private charge point operators have seen that investment opportunity and have chosen to go, often in areas where there are higher numbers of electric vehicles at the moment. And then local authorities who have either with government funding or their own chosen to install public charge points themselves at the moment. Again, the lesson we learnt, and again reflecting on the previous work of this committee, was to change our approach with the local electricity vehicle infrastructure scheme to make it available to all local authorities and to allocate funding not by competition but on assessment of their needs and the progress with charge points. So that was one of the core...
Sometimes it's not about the allocation of money, it's about their ability as a local authority to be able to navigate what is often complicated procurement processes.
Absolutely, and Nick can add more, but therefore what we have done in terms of providing funding to the local authorities and a support body to make sure that all local authorities are able to develop their strategies and implement it. Nick, I don't think you want to...
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think on top of capital funding, we've provided capability funding, which is precisely for resource and staff in those areas. That capability funding can be spent on legal advice, it can be spent on procurement advice as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be just strategy and policies. So I think we've really seen the benefit of that, and we're really pleased that every single local authority is engaged with the programme.
Thank you. May I just also ask you about projected timelines for any planning policy legislative changes, because the infrastructure costs of the projects is often quite considerable, and there have been recommendations previously that any planning legislative changes might help. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
So we were able to announce on the 24th of December a number of changes to ease those barriers to planning. So changes to permitted development, changes to the process and being able to use Street Manager and some wider work on grid connections, precisely to make it as easy as possible, both for private charge point operators, but actually also these locally funded public charge points to get into use.
I think some of my colleagues might pick that up again. Okay. Very, very finely, Chair. In terms of the market itself and providers, is it a competitive market? And if we were to look at the £240 million that has been spent, is that reflected in the spend? By that I mean, has it just gone to two providers, or does it reflect a competitive market, if it is the case, indeed, a competitive market?
Yeah, it's a fiercely competitive market. I think there's some interesting... So there's a broader charge point market, and then there's particularly investing in on-street charging infrastructure through the Levi Fund. What we're seeing is the sort of subsidy per charge point that's coming in from those bids is far lower than we maybe expected. It's also far lower than we originally had when we had original grant schemes where we were giving out X pounds per charge point, because there's much more competition now. So there's quite a lot of bids. And the reason for that is that the way those procurements are going to work is they're going to often give an operator some degree of exclusivity for a period of time. So they're worth quite a lot to those operators. That's to make it economically attractive for them to invest and put a number of charge points out there. So they're very competitive.
And is that, it's very competitive, and therefore if we looked at the spend of public money, is it reflected across a competitive market? It's not concentrated in the hands of one or two providers. You may not know the answer.
So then we have looked kind of historically at previous schemes, so the previous on-street residential charge point scheme, and there was a spread across several companies in that regard. I think under the local EV infrastructure fund, those tenders, or the first few of those tenders are out to market at the moment, so there's about a dozen out there at the moment. The first few are appointing suppliers. We will see as that information comes through, but as Richard says, there is any number of companies out there at the moment who might want to...
Certainly in the early days there was a concern that there was a monopoly from providers, but it sounds as though that has perhaps moved on.
Yes, and I think it's fair to say, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, and other issues through the hearing, that making sure there is a competitive market that works for consumers in the long term is a real priority for us. That has meant some delays in some of our programmes to make sure it is not just benefit now, but this is a market that serves consumers for the sort of decades ahead.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nezel, very much. Clyde Betts, please.
So there's a target that we need to have 300,000 public charging points by 2030 to meet the government's policy of phasing out new diesel and petrol cars by that date. Are you certain that figure of 300,000 is the correct one?
So I think you will see from the report that there is actually considerable uncertainty still in the projected number of charge points. That uncertainty is reducing. So the NAO published our latest data, which both sort of narrows and reduces the range, but there is still a wide range. So 300,000 is the minimum we project we need, but there is good progress and we're pleased to be on track with that. The sort of factors affecting those projections are technological changes in the batteries of the vehicles, the charging, but it's a lot about consumer preference and consumer habit. That is what's really driven the reduction in the range over the last couple of years, but it's something we continue to monitor on an ongoing basis because it is uncertain at the moment. Richard, and then you want...
Change their 2030 target for phasing out new diesel and petrol cars. Would that have a significant impact on your estimates?
So I think, as the government said in the consultation we published on Christmas Eve, what we what is important for everyone here is providing confidence to the investors in charge points to roll it out, and confidence to consumers and to drivers that they will have access to the charge points they need. So I think from our point of view, the more confidence we can give to both drivers and to charge point operators, the better.
I'll just add to that. I mean, the existence of really clear phase-out dates triggered itself billions of pounds of private sector investment in charging infrastructure, £6 billion out to 2030, which has led to this competitive landscape because people could see that by this point in time there would be a known number of vehicles on the road that would need charging. So it's been really helpful in that sense. That's 100% by 2035, 80% by 2030. Those numbers aren't changing with the consultation that's recently been launched. It's more about that minority of vehicles that are left on the road from 2030 to 2035 that are not EV. What technology should be allowed then? What sort of hybridisation should be permitted? But for the charging sector, it's the 80% and the 100% that have really driven the investment and gives great certainty.
What happens if you find that more charge points are needed? Would it be an easy job to expand the number beyond 300,000?
I mean, I think you're seeing from the rate of take-up both of the low power on-street charging, but also the really good progress in rapid charging. The market is responding, so we can continue to keep on review. We publish official statistics quarterly on a sort of disaggregated regional basis, so it's something we keep on to review. But so far, so good. I would say it's a huge challenge, but so far, so good.
You believe the market would be respond that what will happen if the number of charge points is proved to be required is proved to be higher than currently forecast? You think the market will respond without any need for further government intervention?
So I'd say at the moment our overall approach is to make this so far I think 3/4 of public charge points are entirely privately funded. So there's work for us to do to make it as easy as possible, the planning changes we were mentioning before, and then to focus government's efforts, be that regulatory or funding, on those areas where there is a market failure and we need to act. And I think that's the approach you'll continue to see.
You're confident both the market and government can respond quickly enough if the number needed is proved to be greater?
Yeah, I think we have the sort of granularity of reporting on what is going on and confidence in how it is progressing, but it is a big challenge and we need to continue to stay very focused on it.
And there's a broader point, if I may, on how many charge points are needed, because there's almost two different charging infrastructures. There's what you need people to be confident in so they can buy an EV, and there's what they'll actually use. And they're actually quite different. So people want to see lots and lots of charge points out there so they can feel owning an electric vehicle. What they actually use is probably quite different, because if they've got off-street parking, they will charge at home the vast majority of the time. They will not be using public charging that often. So there's a balance to be struck in terms of targets and numbers, and it's all in flux at the moment. The technology is in flux in terms of how good and how cheap batteries are becoming, and the behaviour of consumers is also in flux because we're not yet sure how often they're going to charge publicly.
Just to add to Mr. Betts's question, is the market that you're seeking one like the petrol stations? Clearly, in areas of high demand, you'll get more charging points, but the demand will dictate how many charging points you want in one particular area. You're not in any way, through your planning, loosening, going to dictate how many charging points there should be in any one area. That's up to the market. Is that correct?
So I'd say we would consider it our responsibility to make sure drivers are able to charge, just as drivers are today, are able to access the fuel they need. That's why we monitor what we call the cold spots on the strategic road network. They're reducing, but it's why we're very focused on monitoring that and working with local authorities to make sure they have the right strategies for the sort of makeup of the housing mix in their particular areas. I'm sure there will continue to be need for government intervention in some places, but broadly we see, as Richard said, this is a very attractive market for investors, and that is what's really driving the rollout to date.
Yes, well, others will be coming on to the issue of geographical spread, but basically, just to be clear, there is going to be no restriction by government on the number of charging points in any particular area.
I don't foresee us restricting the numbers.
None at all. Okay, fine, fair enough. Chris Kane, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Can I go to the geographic spread a little bit, please? A well-functioning network is going to need charging points spread out everywhere, so across the UK and within the regions of the UK. So it's not just a regional spread, it's within the regions themselves. I think you sort of started to touch this when Nezel asked the question earlier, but could you go into a little bit more detail as to how you're going to ensure that there is a good spread of the points across the country. And I'm also interested in this concept of a well-functioning network. What does that look like?
Thank you. So, as I said, we completely agree that today there isn't an even spread across the country. And obviously the data you're seeing at the moment is before any impact of the Levi programme. So we currently have 70,000 public charge points UK-wide. Levi will add over 100,000 in England alone. So it's a very material change. And the way it's been designed, going to all local authorities and funding assessed by need will make a big difference there. I think this point about sort of within regions is really interesting, and you're absolutely right. It's actually at quite a local level that you're able to look at the needs. When you're looking at in rural areas, 86% of houses have off-street parking. Urban and cities, that's 45%. You could have a village with a lot of terrace housing needing a higher number of public charging points versus a suburban community in a city with a lot of off-street parking. That goes back to why we have felt it important and are pleased with the progress in working through local authorities who are able, along with their other highways powers, their parking planning, able to look at the right approach for their community. There's then separately the work with the strategic road network where, as you see through the report, we're monitoring those cold spots and working with motorway service areas we might come on to make sure that provision is in place for the, as Richard said earlier, the en route charging for a long journey as opposed to your regular week in, week out charging for the journeys you might do closer to home.
Yeah, I was reading an email. So I'm the MP for Stirling. So when I look at the map in the report in Figure 4, so I'm going to talk Scotland, but I know we're here to talk more England. When I see that Scotland figure of 103 per 100,000, I know that in my constituency of Stirling it's 208 per 100,000, and there's a massive range within it. But I also, when I try and imagine what Scotland would look like if I broke that down, I suspect it would look very good along the A9, but not the same everywhere else. And I suspect my colleagues would agree that's a picture across the UK. So using the strategic road network is fine, but getting to the strategic road network and then getting to your destination at the end. So this morning I was reading an email from Mark, who's one of my constituents in Balfron, and he was talking about a trip he was taking from Stirling to Whitby. And he said that he had to hire a petrol car because it was fine for the strategic road network, but it was the bit getting from Balfron to it and then the bit getting from the strategic at the other end that gave him problems. So how are you going to ensure that spread is not just the strategic road network, it is spread in a way that gives people the confidence to invest in the technology?
Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, I think, for EV owners, I guess there's two sorts of charging. There is overnight charging, typically at home, ideally on cheap off-peak electricity, and there's the ability to stop if you're making a long journey en route. So that's the best offer for an EV driver today is can I plug in at night when my battery is low, wake up in the morning, it's 100%, and if I'm driving more than, let's say, 200 miles, is there somewhere on the route I can stop and quickly, at a high-powered charger, add electricity to my car so I can complete my journey? And that's where we focus on in terms of the interventions from government. One is on people who haven't got driveways, so somewhere locally they can charge overnight, and then looking at the strategic road network, where are the cold spots and what is the offer at motorway service areas. The actual sheer number of charge points for other purposes in supermarket car parks and other car parks, at hotels, I don't think they have a huge bearing on the adoption of EVs. If people can charge overnight and they can stop and do a long journey, those are the two key drivers of EV adoption. And that's why targets are very different, because if you've got an area with lots and lots of off-street parking, they don't need many on-street chargers, and if they've got good provision of high-power chargers on major roads, they're basically okay. It's if you've got an area which has got lots of on-street parking, not much off-street parking, and therefore charging, they're the areas that need a focus. That can be very, very different within one county, let alone across the entire country. So be able to say you need this number here is quite challenging.
How are you going to determine, in terms of the 300,000 number or greater, you're going to have to determine what's the suitable number of charge points for rural areas to give that confidence in the network? You could, quite easily achieve the 300,000 in the London area alone. The way if you were going in that early adoption area, you could get to the point where you have, in terms of your cold map, some incredibly hot spots and some incredibly cold spots. So what are you going to do to make sure that you know how to heat up the cold areas appropriately.
You go first.
So I said, so the Levi funding, by the virtue of it's going to every local authority, and the formula is based on both population, level of off-street parking, number of charge points today, but then with an uplift for rurality and deprivation to make sure it's targeted to need and the progress today. The 15% mentioned in the NAO report of public charge points in rural areas is on one measure sort of what you would expect at this point. 17% of the population in England live in rural areas on the same definition, and as I said before, with a higher proportion of off-street parking. So it is about the interventions we have through Levi, through our work on the strategic road network, and then the monitoring that we do every quarter on a constituency level and looking at the urban-rural split, so that we are continually keeping under review.
The other point worth adding is that if you talk to a charge point company, they're looking to maximise utilisation of their equipment when they roll it out. And that is not going to be in cities like London. It's going to be in areas where you've got high car dependency and people drive a very long way. So it's actually more likely in your market towns and rural areas you get much better usage and therefore much more revenue for them than you will in towns and cities, because there you've got public transport alternatives. People don't use their car all the time, and then they don't drive very far. So if you're car dependent, drive a long way, you'll need to put more electricity in your car, so there's much better return. So ultimately, not necessarily true today, but ultimately when the entire fleet of cars in the UK is zero emission, then those areas in market towns, places like that, they'll have the highest utilisation relative to cities.
Bear with me just a couple. I know that within local authorities, David Hopper's his name. He's the chap who does this, and he's really on top of his brief. Not all local authorities are created equal. So how are you going to make sure that local authorities have the wherewithal to make sure that they are pushing this out and an even spread? Because I would imagine you will get, and I can see this looking in Scotland at the different numbers per 100,000, you're going to get different authorities taking different approaches, and a lot of that's going to be to do with how much the individuals who are there are buying into this and pushing this forward.
Absolutely. It's one of the things so far we're really pleased about with how the Levi scheme is working, but I might ask Nick to explain.
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. I think what we saw through the previous on-street residential scheme was there were several councils who turned up kind of time and time again because of really good local officers that meant really good rollout. There is a reason that Coventry has really good rollout of charges, and it's down to a number of very good officers in that area, and so I think there is, you're entirely right in terms of that place. What we have done is we're trying to instigate that level of interest and support everyone. We're funding it, so we're funding staff in local authorities, and we're up to, I think, just shy of a couple of hundred people in local authorities across England in roles that are here to do local charging and look at charging across the piece. They are a cohort. They can learn from each other. We also provide them with bespoke training as well, which has been a real success of this scheme to date, is that kind of cohort and increasing the level of knowledge and the level of interest in local authorities to do this.
If you can tell us just one more chair, maybe there's a big one. I notice when I look at this from an English perspective, coming as a Scottish MP, the approach that's taken in England is different from the approach that's taken in Scotland. I find it also, I got a wry smile when I say this, the problems and the challenges that come from constituents seem very similar, regardless of the approach. What are you learning from the home nations? How are you ensuring that best practice is a shared endeavour from the internal UK perspective? But then there are also some exciting things happening around the world. This is a worldwide issue that we're dealing with. How are you ensuring that we're learning best practice from around the world as well?
Absolutely, and there's lots to learn across the four nations, and we speak to Transport Scotland and the equivalents frequently, Richard.
We have a very good relationship with the devolved administrations and what they are doing, and we share what we're doing and they share what they're doing. I mean, Scotland's got a fantastic, if I remember correctly, ratio of rapid charges per head. I think it's second only to the southeast of England. It's way ahead of London.
I would just interrupt because it's important to see when you say Scotland, you almost certainly mean the A9 or the corridor in between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and it's a problem I look at when I see the map, and I'm learning this from a regional perspective in England, is that the areas you're talking about are so big that sometimes it masks the variations within the region, and I would always implore so my plea to the UK Parliament generally, when you see a map of Scotland, it's really important to realise the differences in that are sometimes more stark than the other regions in England because the geography is so much bigger.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of driving in Scotland. I entirely agree with that. It takes a long time to get some places around the islands on the left. What things like the cold spot analysis we're doing, which is mainly focused on England, we're looking at sharing that with devolved governments and looking at where those cold spots are in Wales and Scotland and in Northern Ireland as well. So we can identify why is that not a market solution for this stretch of road where you're leaving drivers worrying basically whether they can make the end of their journey, and then what the intervention required is to basically fill that cold spot effectively.
You're learning, you are all talking, you can give an assurance that you're talking to each other and there's an international conversation going on as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Chair.
So, Ms. Shanmugalingam, can I just challenge your assertion a little bit that the only measure we should be considering is the number of charge points per head? Now, representing an area which gets a lot of tourists, in fact, many of my communities double in the summer, and looking at the heat map on figure 8, a lot of the coastline of our country, which does get a lot of tourism, it doesn't even show the local A roads, and therefore doesn't even show, but I suspect there's a very high percentage of that is not got sufficient charge points. What are you going to do to make sure that there are sufficient charge points in those areas, particularly in the rural areas of this country, so that we don't get a sort of two-tier type system in this country?
You're absolutely right, and we were, as an exec team in Cornwall earlier in the year, thinking about the particular challenges for them as a peninsular tourist destination. So absolutely, I think what the Levi scheme does, though, is gives a sort of a more equitable distribution of funding than the competition basis before. Richard or Nick may have more to add. I think it is also, though, why we do think local authorities taking a view about what is right, because, as you say, it is absolutely essential for confidence of tourists, for those local economies, that people know they are going to be able to charge when they get there. So I absolutely agree. I don't know if either of you...
Do you want to go first, Nick?
I'll go first. So I think firstly, you're entirely right, and it's something we do spend our time thinking about. I think there is there is kind of the commercial factor. If lots of people are travelling to those places, it makes sense for charging companies to put charges where they need to charge, and that will be particularly the case for when you've driven a long way to get there, and as such, the market should kind of react to that and look to do that. But nevertheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will always put them exactly where they're always needed, and seasonality comes into that as an approach as well. So I think, I'm repeating Joe slightly, but the input of local authorities about where those precise actions are is really why local authorities should be driving this on a kind of a strategy-wide basis. Yeah,
and just to be fair, we are seeing that because we look at all these proposals from every local authority across the country, and we are seeing tourist influxes being reflected in what they are planning and where they are planning to put charges, which car parks they're using and the power of the charges as well. So it's not all just low power charges, it might be high power charges for tourists. So it is being reflected. There is a mixed approach by local authorities across the country, and some are more or less ambitious, I think, in their approach, but lots of them are thinking about the context, who comes to areas, why do they come, where do they park, where are they going to stay. So they are thinking about it.
So if we get towards 2030 and we're not seeing this equitable distribution, are you open to more government intervention into those areas where there are distinct cool spots?
So ultimately that will be a question for ministers, future spending review, but I can absolutely assure you that we regularly monitor precisely to make sure that from a national government point of view we have that overview, and if issues were emerging of concern, particularly once we get to the end of the rollout of the Levi programme and we can see the difference that's made in a sort of a minimum level, to then give drivers confidence and the charge point industry confidence to further, then of course that is why we're monitoring the information.
Thank you. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Shanmugalingam, we've talked a bit about obviously the gaps in the charge point infrastructure. What are the remaining significant challenges to overcoming those? What are the biggest issues you're dealing with in order to fill in the gaps?
In terms of the distribution of charge points?
Yes.
Yeah. So getting the Levi scheme to successful completion, all of the funding now with local authorities and supporting them with that rollout. We were pleased to be able to confirm, following the NAO report, continuation of the capability funding to support that investment of electric vehicle infrastructure officers that Nick previously mentioned. The rapid charging network, you can see from the report, actually progressing much faster than we had thought. So very encouraging, but and the cold spots are reducing, but they are still there, and there is.
So with the remaining cold spots, what is the challenge in addressing those?
So there are particular issues about motorway service areas, I'm sure we'll come on to. On the strategic road network, more generally, where there is flexibility inherently in where charge point operators seek to advance. At the moment, we are both working with them generally on issues to make it as easy as possible for them to install these hubs. But we continue to monitor. We are seeing those cold spots, reducing quarter by quarter. If there became particular areas of concern, that's something we would look at that point.
I think it's worth thinking about the charge point companies are basically looking to try and secure the best possible spots that are still available on the strategic road network. So that's why there's much of a speedy reduction in those cold spots, because they're thinking about where they can put a rapid hub, get a cheap grid connection and service people. That's why it's decreasing so quickly. The question for us is, after that process has happened, are there very hard to connect areas that are of strategic importance in terms of journeys people make that might need some assistance in terms of getting an offer in those places in, for example, through national parks or places that are very remote, so there isn't enough electricity there. But it's moving so quickly. As soon as we identify one set of cold spots, and the next month they've disappeared. So there's been a doubling number of rapid hubs in a year because there's so much investment going in. So it's a very dynamic situation, and we need to talk to the charge point companies about where there are geographical areas where it might be really, really hard, and think there about whether we need to intervene.
Thank you. So talking about that continued investment, the department is currently consulting on changes to the ZEV mandate, the Zero Emission Vehicles mandate. Looking at the written evidence, I think was Charge UK, the body for companies providing charging. They're very concerned that that the result of that consultation means you're going to scale back the mandate. But I know also there's pressure from motor vehicle manufacturers to scale that back because they're struggling to meet the mandate, in accordance with the demand from the market, which perhaps isn't quite where, the demand for new electric vehicles isn't quite where the mandate would like them to be. I wonder, Ms. Shanmugalingam, if you can just comment a little bit on that consultation process.
If you don't mind, Richard.
Of course not.
We'll be able to give you the full details of exactly what's in there.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Parts.
So I think two things about the consultation is worth noting. One is it does reflect some concerns that some car companies have had, but it's very clear there's no change to the phase-out dates and there's no change to the trajectory of the mandate, which has these percentages going at 22% last year, 28% this year, 80% 2030, and then eventually 100% 2035. So, and that was because we really, really, really want to give certainty both to the car industry and to the charge point industry about this uptake of EVs over time. When the mandate was designed, it was after literally years of negotiation with the car industry about what flexibility they needed in order to achieve it. So there's lots of stuff baked into it. And they don't actually have to hit the headline percentage to become compliant and not pay a fine. So different car companies are in different places on their journey towards zero-emission vehicles. Some have got lots of hybrid technology, some are going to come along with lots and lots of zero-emission vehicles in the next few years. So the flexibilities reflect that. The question is whether the current suite of flexibilities, borrowing from the future, overachieving on your non-zero-emission cars, is still the correct suite of flexibilities. There is a question there about that, but the headline trajectory will not be changing because we want to give the certainty. Does that answer your question?
So what you're saying is that even if you make changes to the ZEV mandate, you don't see that impacting the investment levels for charging infrastructure?
Not significantly, no.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you.
We can do VAT.
VAT. What does that mean? Yes, VAT. This is another significant area of public interest. So obviously, if you're charging at home on your driveway, you are paying a reduced level of VAT on that electricity, but you're paying, I think, at the 20% rate for public charge point. Now, that obviously creates a significant inequality depending on whether you're charging at home or charging in public. Does the department have any proposals to address that?
On that specifically, you'll understand it's a matter for the Treasury as part of the overall tax position. But we are
making representations.
We are doing a number of things to make sure. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the operating costs of an electric vehicle compare very favourably in all circumstances to petrol or diesel, from maintenance to fuel effectively. But you're right,
There's
there are significant...
still this big disparity.
There are disparities. There are a number of things we are doing as part of the planning changes we announced just before Christmas, was new guidance to local authorities about how they can consider applications for gullies, how you sort of safely, considering all sort of users of footways, take a charging cable across a pavement, and how local authorities might look at that. So that means if you have parking outside your house but not off street, you can take advantage. And it goes back to the discussion before about...
you there. As a representative of a constituency with a lot of on-street parking, I can tell you that isn't going to address the issue, because it's quite rare that you get to park directly outside your own home.
It's probably different in different communities across the country. So there will be a number of communities where people are frequently able to park outside their house, but not with off-street
parking. The disparity will still remain.
The disparity in the VAT, yes. But it goes back to the changes we were talking about before, and the importance of competition in the market, but also the work we've done to introduce standardised pricing information so that consumers are able to compare the cost of the different public charge point offers they have, and therefore drive competition.
I think, well, a couple of points. I mean, the VAT isn't the only driver of the difference in cost between home charging and commercial charging on the street, because they have to recoup the cost of their investment. But what we are seeing is you're seeing the availability of EV charging become something that becomes commercially attractive to people. So they might be offering discounted rates of charging. You can see as low as 20 pence a kilowatt hour sometimes, which is almost the same as a non-off-peak domestic rate, to try and encourage people to park at certain places and charge there. The other issue, I think, is that as this market matures, there's cheaper and cheaper tariffs available to consumers for doing things like ceding control of when their vehicle charges, which you can do on street or at home, and ultimately vehicle to grid, where you're giving power back from the EV to the grid, which will give you an even cheaper tariff. So what we want to make sure, one of the reasons we have the Levi Fund, is that people have the ability to make the most of those services by getting the cheapest possible tariff, irrespective of where they are charging, so they can basically cede control, and they can also do vehicle to grid in due course, which is much harder to do with rapid charging. So low power overnight charging gives the opportunity to have these much cheaper tariffs. And that is starting to come as the market matures.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
So just to follow up Ms. Olney's question, Mr. Bruce, I mean, clearly there is a significant difference in the cost between on-street and off-street charging, of which VAT is a significant distortive driver. And it's also discriminatory, because those disadvantaged communities are more likely to have to, if they are able and have to have a car for their work, more likely to have to charge their cars on the on-street chargers. So this is a serious issue, and I think Ms. Olney's question is, are you really pointing this out to Treasury to really have a serious look at?
So I'd say we absolutely hear what you say. Tax matters are for the Treasury. What we can do is make sure that wherever somebody is charging, we do what we can to make the market work so that it is as cheap as possible, whatever the form, and the Treasury will look at the tax implications.
But we do, lots of other people are making that point to the Treasury.
Yes. And your issue of day and night meters is an interesting one. I've not seen many charge points that actually started to adopt that. It makes eminent sense from the grid's point of view. Is there anything in government you're doing to encourage that?
Well, one of the things is the transparency on pricing, to make sure that the charging companies are making clear what it costs when. And some of them already do offer an off-peak rate that is different to their peak rate. And you're seeing it not just actually in overnight charging, also some of the rapid charges to try and encourage people to come at quieter times, different rates at different times. So it will come, and it is starting to appear.
And Richard, am I right in saying that for home charging, we required a couple of years ago that all home chargers are smart enabled, so that the 70% of homes with off-street parking can benefit from those tariffs?
Yeah.
On that question, is there any move to that all new houses should have chargers installed?
That is a requirement.
That is a requirement.
Thank you. Yeah. Chris Kane.
Yeah, apologies, Chair. I almost butted into that. Apologies. My mouth engaged without my brain thinking there. It was just when I was listening to you there. Do you have a full picture of, if there was 100% take up of EVs in this country, what proportion of the properties would have the ability to do off-street parking versus on-street parking? And I would imagine that is something that we could get a broad brush look at. Do you then break down the take-up so you're getting a sense of what's happening with on-street parking in areas where you can park outside your house versus areas in town centres where you can't? Are you getting a sense of the type of property and how people are engaging with it and how that's breaking down at the figures?
Yeah, I start and then colleagues will want to add. I mean, I think your question lies behind all of the scenario modelling, and it's set out here in the NAO report. So, we know that 70% of homes have off-street parking. Current assessment, about 80% of charging needs likely to be met off-street. The reason for that uncertainty we talked about earlier is because of those changing habits. So that is our research programme to make sure we have the best understanding of both the technological changes but the consumer habits and consumer choice as well, Richard.
It was just to say, I get when we talk about off-street parking, but it was just, we're hearing that there's differences in off-street parking. I mean, you talk about, when you see properties you can't park outside straight away, in my head that's a town centre street with terraced houses, whereas in my constituency I live in an estate where there's not a lot of off-street parking, but it's quiet, so you can get parked outside your house. So within that on-street there is multiple variations. I'm just checking, are you tracking that?
So I can come in on that. So yes, there are definitions. I'm afraid I can't remember the precise source, but we have kind of government statistics that kind of separates adequate on-street parking from inadequate on-street parking, and so you can segment the data in that kind of way. So you can start to look at things. When we mentioned kind of gullies before, they're not going to be a solution for every single house that has off-street parking, but there is another segment of the population who might be able to access home tariffs on top of those with off-street parking.
I think, just on that point, we were quite surprised by the number of houses that might be able to park routinely outside their house on the street. Because it's coming from a London prism, it sort of never ever happens. But actually, in lots of areas where there is, more plentiful residential parking on the street, it's actually quite common. And you only need to probably park outside your house once a week, given typical mileages and typical charging patterns, in order to be able to charge your car. So that might mean there's quite a significant portion of that 30% without off-street parking who can actually access these much cheaper rates and the convenience of having a home charger.
Thank you. Clive, Bex, please.
Just coming back to the Levi scheme, do you know when all the money in the scheme will be spent?
If I could pass that to Nick.
Yeah, sure. So I think we currently have, we've provided quite a lot of funding to local authorities, so they get funding. From the start of the scheme, they've known their allocation of funding, and which enabled them to make plans. And on receiving that plan, we have tested them and gone back to quite a few of them to work through iterations. At the point we are content for them to go to tender, we provide the funding. Lots of them are working through those invitations to tender now. They're working through their procurement documentation. Once they are at a point and we have had a look at them, we'll provide the funding. And so the intention is in the main case is to have everything out by the end of this financial year to local authorities. It is then for them to then tender and work with private suppliers after that.
When will it be spent by?
So spent in terms of being with the local authorities by the end of the
actually spent.
So that will be over a period of time. It depends on the individual contracts that the local authorities will set up with their suppliers and various milestones within that.
Okay, but you're providing money to local authorities to deliver a government objective. Therefore, the objective is actually to have the charges there for people to use. So haven't you got an assessment as to when the money will have been spent and the charges will actually be there?
So I think we see each individual local authority is different and they each have different plans. I think we expect them, the majority to be going in, starting from kind of now and this year, for the next 2 to 4 years will be the majority. Some local authorities are doing phased approaches, where they're doing one phase and then considering their second phase after that, which might be on a slightly longer timeline. I think the majority will be kind of up to between now and 2 to 4 years.
Just on that point, to come in with Nick, I think there is a question not just about capability within local authorities, but also within the industry. So if we dolloped out all the money in one big go to one enormous procurement, I don't think you'd probably get suboptimal procurements by local authorities. It's actually probably better to phase the delivery of those charge points and the procurement into lots, as many of them have done over a period of time, to make sure that you get them appearing on the streets, rather than having a big procurement which basically might squeeze the ability of the industry to deliver it.
Well, haven't you asked local authorities the questions then about what their plans now are likely to mean in terms of the actual phase out of phasing in of new charging points?
So we do manage that, and we look at that very closely, and so each month we look at what local authorities are telling us about their plans for procurement and when they plan to go out. We're really keen that we don't artificially try and shuffle those into an order, because there's any number of reasons why dates for procurement move around, and to date all we think we do would be artificially delay some local authorities from going out. But we do keep a really close eye on it, and that's always an option we have if we start to see things bunching up, is to talk to local authorities around what else is likely to appear at that time.
And Nick, am I right, we share that information with local authorities so they can see the sort of indicative
authorities.
pipeline of procurements between them, and they can take judgments themselves.
It'll all be spent by 2030, will it?
So in terms of
money?
So, well, it depends on the individual bits of the contract, and so if you have a final payment once the last charge point goes in an area that's putting thousands and thousands and thousands in, some of them are really significant and they'll be longer than 5 years, but the vast majority will be well ahead of that point.
Isn't this part of the objective to get the 300,000 charge points by 2030? So surely the money is designed to achieve that. Shouldn't it be spent by 2030?
So I think, I'm going to repeat myself, I think the vast majority will be by then. I think some projects are longer term than that, and so where they're seeing huge amounts more, and they're huge amounts than they've ever done previously, I think it's right that they have a sensible kind of installation scheme that they can meet.
I think this also goes back to the point we discussed before, that at the moment 3/4 of the public charge points are privately financed. What we are doing here is trying to sort of lift the base level everywhere, in part to inspire confidence for further private investment.
And are you certain that the money available for the Levi scheme is sufficient to deliver the charge points that are necessary?
I think we are confident it's sufficient to deliver more than 100,000. That, I think, as Joe mentioned earlier, we will have to look in 2 and 3 years' time how that progression is going. If we are still seeing cold spots, there's a choice for future ministers and spending reviews about any future action that's taken.
Is it worth just briefly, Nick, explaining how this has been structured in terms of the sort of subsidy, or sort of seeking, going to the market and to see how many can be provided,
well,
or
quite. And
sort of
so
least?
I think this comes down to the point of, each allocation has gone to a local authority. They know what they are asking for, and so they're putting that money to the market and looking for private investment that goes alongside that, and testing what levels of provision can be provided by the market.
Right. So it might be that once local authorities are put more projects out to tender, it could be that the money available isn't sufficient.
Well, I think it will be sufficient to raise the levels of provision significantly in all places. Whether or not that is the final piece of public funding that ever goes on local charging, I think we'll have to see how well that goes.
When will you know that by?
So I think we'll be looking at it throughout the lifetime of the rollout of the scheme. So I think over the next couple of years we'll have a good sense of the likely levels of rollout that are occurring, that are likely to occur, and whether or not there remain areas that might be underserved.
Have you learnt any lessons from this exercise that you might want to apply to other aspects of the programme?
Gosh, lots. And so I think, firstly, the importance of the kind of capability funding and the resource in the local authorities. I think provision of that at the earliest possible stage is really important. So, the resource money almost needs to come before the capital, in that they need to be working through the plans before the capital is available. And I think one of the reasons we've extended resource funding into next financial year is to kind of continue that, to support that. I think working on previous schemes, the allocation work has really worked. Like I say, every single local authority is engaged with the scheme. Less than half of eligible local authorities engaged with the previous scheme when it was a demand-led, turn up with an application piece. And so really kind of learning from that is something we'd take forward around, going to each local authority and saying, here is your allocation, give us an application for it, as opposed to saying, give us an application, then we'll do that.
And I would say more generally, thinking back to your hearing on local highways maintenance before Christmas, I think there's lots of really positive lessons we can learn for the department's work more generally in what has worked through Levi in supporting local authorities, supporting the capability, the training, the sharing of best practice for what we do in any number of other areas with local authorities.
Thank you very much. Peter Fortune.
Thank you. So to build on that, once the Levi funding comes to an end, what plans, if any, are there to provide ongoing support?
That will be a question for the spending review in terms of future funding. So further funding has been announced by the Chancellor for this the financial year we are coming into. But it will be a question for the spending review, and we'll want to learn the lessons and see how we are how Levi is progressing, how our other interventions are progressing.
There's no current plans in place. It's just waiting for that review.
Yes, but inherently, because we don't, it's a matter for the spending review, any capital budgets from 26, 27 onwards.
And sorry, I did come into the meeting a bit late, so you may have touched on this. I apologise, Chair, if that's the case. But we've been talking about supporting local authorities for the delivery of this. Specifically, what sort of things are you doing to support local authorities and adapting to the different needs? I was interested listening to Chris when he was talking about his beloved Scotland and the size of it and the number, perhaps giving a sort of a twisted view of it, as it were. We have the same sort of thing in London, where, Richard, you talked about London being a built-up area. Well, where I represent in Bromley and Biggin Hill, a lot of it isn't, right? And we've got I've actually got researchers now trying to work out how many driveways we have. We've got quite a lot of proper off-street parking in terms of an old traditional driveway. So that's very different to somewhere like Tower Hamlets or Lewisham. So it's recognising those differences. Sorry, so go on.
I was going to say, you can see in the constituency data at a London level, it is very different, the provision today, but likely the future need. But
yes, in terms of support, basically we provide resource funding to local authorities, which enables them to hire staff to work on these areas. They can also use that funding for kind of procurement resource, for legal resource, for basically anything sensible that is within the realms of increasing provision of charging infrastructure. And I think we've seen that we've had a real impact to date. And, the feedback we get from industry is there is a more kind of recognisable conversation they can have with local authorities, where previously that it might have been a small part of someone's job alongside a lot of other things. We've also provided kind of bespoke training for those individuals, and we also set up as a cohort, between themselves, so they can learn from each other, and really helping those that are further ahead and are into kind of several rounds of having rolled out infrastructure can really help those that are doing it for the first time.
I guess what I'm driving at is, excuse the pun, there's not a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to this. Local authorities are being spoken to, and there are bespoke models being prepared.
So I would differentiate, or I'd think about it in two different ways. There's a universal offer of support and sharing of best practice, but learning the lessons as identified by the NEO of our previous work. To recognise that local authorities are the right people to look at the strategies for their area, and we can then support them in delivering that strategy. And I think it's fair to say, it goes back to the previous questions about procurement size, some are choosing to work together where that makes sense for the sort of geography and going to market, but it's helping local authorities establish the right strategy for their communities.
Are there any bumps in the road? Sorry, I'll stop now. Looking at the local authority white paper and some of the changes that are coming along, is that going to affect any sort of delivery or rollout?
And so we will work with the devolution white paper sets out lots of areas. I think we are working really closely with the colleagues who are leading with that, and we will ensure that that work kind of fits together.
Because that may cause some delay in the programme, as there's a sort of, an ontological view of what the local authorities are and where their boundaries are.
I don't think it will change who we are, the sort of tier at which we're allocating the funding through this programme.
So because the current funding is due to roll out, as it will, and that shouldn't be affected by the forthcoming devolutions, one of the things we'll have to think about for any future area or any future funding will be the level of devolution at that point.
Yeah, the money would all be grouped into sort of 78 different Levi projects. So we expect those to sort of pertain whatever happens under devolution in the future.
And just for the record, I love Scotland as well. I don't want to be misrepresented. Thank you.
Right, Sarah Olney, please. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so just thinking about the charge point gaps along major A roads, Mr. Bruce, which particular A roads do you think are currently the worst for lack of charge points?
Well, we could send you the updated data if you'd like. I think there's some areas in the east of England, there's some areas in the southwest. It also depends on your criteria. So when we initially did this work, we looked at how far you're away from one rapid charge point on these roads. And there are very, very few cold spots. And actually we thought, well, is that a compelling offer to a prospective EV driver? And decided no. So now we're looking at 6 rapid chargers in a hub, which is much more compelling. And actually there's now more cold spots using that criteria. So the map looks slightly worse. But as I say, they are being deployed so quickly, it's a very dynamic situation.
You say being deployed so quickly, and a lot of that is due to the private investment, but are there areas of the country which are particularly lacking for lack of ability to attract that investment?
I think it's premature to say, to be perfectly honest. I think there are areas where, if you look at the sort of ratios to head and that sort of stuff, the North East doesn't look great in terms of absolute numbers, but actually its ratio in terms of population isn't too bad in terms of rapid charging. And there's at least 5, I think, English regions. We've all got very similar numbers of rapid chargers already. South East is ahead, which is fair to say. But Scotland is ahead of London. London's sort of in the pack. North East doesn't look great. So there's some areas I think that will need developing. But I guess the other point to land is there are teams of people in charge point companies whose entire job is to work out where there are gaps that they can basically invest in and secure that real estate on a juicy road on a long journey where they can make money. So we can do the analysis and see how it's changing over time, but it's not yet clear that there's somewhere that government needs to absolutely intervene because there's a sort of perennial cold spot that isn't being filled very quickly.
I think as Richard mentioned earlier, one of the areas, and you can see it from the map, that we sort of keep an eye on is sort of national parks and other sort of similar areas where you might not have those grid connections. So the A30 going over the top of Dartmoor, I think the A66 coming through the lake. So I mean, I think interesting, question that we just need to keep under review as we continue to see these cold spots reducing.
And currently you're confident that the private sector investment out there is sufficient to fill in, as it were, the remaining cold spots, and you expect to see the strategic road network fully charged, if that's the right phrase, at some point in the near future?
I think it's probably slightly too early to tell. Maybe over the next year or so, will be, because the rate of deployment, it'll be clear if there are genuine areas where there's not enough power in those locations. But the advantage on the strategic road network compared to the motorway networks is that you're not stuck with one key location. So an MSA, motorway service area, is where it is. It can't be moved. Whereas along a strategic road, if there are a variety of different spots where you might be able to get power and put some charge points, you can do that. So it's far more granularity there, far more choice for the charge point companies.
Thank you, Chair.
So can I just follow Ms Olney's questions? I mean, looking at figure 8, which I think Ms Olney was alluding to, the A66, which you, Ms Shanmugalingam, mentioned, is whether you have started, you're about to do a major road scheme there. Where you've got a major road scheme, are you considering how to provide more charging points? Because I have a major road scheme in my patch, the A417 missing air balloon section. Not a single charge point for that 500 million will be delivered. So it does seem to me that there may be a bit of a disconnect here.
Would you talk about our work with National Highways more generally on?
Yeah, so we the work we're doing at the motorway service areas, our delivery partner is National Highways, and so they are getting a whole lot of expertise about how rapid charging works, working with grid connections, working with charge point companies, and working with the motorway service areas. Generally, they are not the ones deploying charging infrastructure. That is all being sort of market-led. We've done a lot of looking at particular motorway service areas and what government intervention might be needed there. And that's more about supporting grid connections rather than deploying charge points. So National Highways has done some work on, for example, rolling out battery packs at remote locations to enable, if you have a big battery, that enables you to have a smaller connection and be able to charge a number of EVs in a peak without needing to have a much bigger connection to the grid there. So they are developing that expertise, but they are not themselves rolling out charging infrastructure at this stage.
Okay, Chris Kane.
Can I ask a question? Distribution and coastal. I'm sort of reminded that when I used to take family trips with my parents in the car coming down the M6 to London, we always stopped at Killington Lake Services. It became almost a habit that's where we stopped, and it was because that's when we were running out of petrol in the car. I'm T-Bay, which is a couple further on, which I think it shows you how engines have changed. In terms of where these cold spots are, human behaviour and how they interact with them, does that count? You could have an area that isn't cold, it's hot, but it gets a reputation as being always busy. So does that factor into your thinking when it comes to the distribution of hot and cold, that some areas will become more popular and it will be based on the length of a strategic journey? So that strategic length of time in between needing the toilet, for example, is also going to determine what stops a journey as much as when the car's running out of energy. So it feels like a very complicated picture that's not the same as, for example, mobile phone coverage, where you just need coverage, but this has got more complications to it. Can you talk to that in your strategic thinking?
Yes, you do, Richard.
It's a really interesting question, a really interesting point. I think so. Let's separate out what's happened at motorway service areas from the cold spot analysis. The cold spot analysis is saying Is there anywhere on the whole of the street and road network, away from the motorways, where if you were getting low on a charge, you're not that close to a hub of rapid chargers to feel you can stop and recharge? And our criteria for that has been, I think, around 16 miles, which is about 10% of the battery capacity of a typical van. So that's quite a tough bar. So it's basically 16 miles, 6 chargers nearby, and that's exposed those gaps in provision. Motorway service areas, I think there is definitely something where people traditionally, I stop at this one, I can't see any charge points at this one, therefore I can't buy an electric vehicle. There might be at the junction, you could drive off for a minute, there might be 30 just off the motorway, but people that I think are quite habituated sometimes into the MSAs they stop at. What we're interested in primarily is what is the offer for consumers, and motorway service areas are the shop window of long distance charging, if you like, because that's where people typically stop, and they may not want to drive off the motorway. So there's something about making sure that the offer that they perceive fits into their habituated driving. When they do that long journey, they stop at T-Bay, which hasn't got much electricity, but has got a battery pack coming in quite soon, I think, and Killington Lake, which might be subject to one of our pilot funding. So there's lots of interest in making sure we have a standard offer at the MSAs, and some of them have got 20, sometimes even 30 charge points sitting there because they've got available electricity. It is a bit of a lottery about how much power is available at those locations, because those locations are fixed.
That motorway network approach, I would imagine, certainly in Scotland, we've got the strategic thinking up the middle. If you take Cornwall not having that motorway provision, they'll still be the behavioural approaches will come into play in the road network that you're looking at. So are you confident that human behaviour and the anxiety that comes from the charges is being addressed in your planning, not just the gap?
I think it's fair to say all of our work on route charging is making sure there is confidence in a visible offer. Obviously, with the private charge point operators, they are commercially incentivised to see where there is additional demand, where people are habitually stopping, and making sure they focus their efforts there, their investment there. It's our job to make sure that there is consistent confidence right way across the country. And we also, through our public attitudes tracker, monitor consumer sentiment and what it is that are concerning both, I think it's right, current EV drivers and non-EV drivers, to see what are the issues that are causing concern and how that is changing over time, which helps us identify whether, how much range anxiety remains an issue, or whether we're making a dent in that as a cause of concern.
We'll just use one last follow-up. If you look at the way the Royal Mail works with its universal service.
I think we must keep going.
Sorry.
Yeah. So before I call Clive Betts, after Clive, we will have a 5-minute comfort break. I don't know whether you've been warned about that.
Range anxiety.
Yeah. So, Clive Betts.
Well, I'll try not to make my questions go on too long then, Chair, in that case. Yes, motorway service stations, sort of the name simply implies that people can get services there. But for owners of electric vehicles, that hasn't been the case at many of them. Why didn't you hit your target of getting the 6 rapid charging points, the ultra rapid charging points, at every motorway service area by 2023?
Yeah, if I start, and I'm sure Richard will want to add. So we rightly set this, or the last government set this ambition. It's effectively a challenge to industry that we believe that, again, 6 was the minimum number of rapid charging hubs that we needed at motorway service areas, and to give that confidence to current EV drivers, but to prospective ones too. It has been hard, and as Richard said, we can't move motorway service areas. So in some places, the questions of how you get the grid connection capacity, and I think, as the NAO report rightly says, the planning system, wasn't designed with charge point operators in mind, and we are, learning a lot in all aspects of this rollout about how to adapt and work with the planning system to support charge point operators. There's actually been a bit more progress since the NAO report. So the latest data we have from industry from the 1st of January is now that 80 of the 114 have the 6 chargers, and 100 expect to have met that challenge by this summer, and all by 4 by the end of 2026. But it absolutely, has been a complicated challenge, and one we continue to work with them on very closely. Richard, if you wanted to say.
I think generally the 6x23 was a fairly, if I'm honest, a fairly arbitrary number about what is a decent offer for people by a certain deadline. But it was a challenge to the sector to say, we really need you to help us work on this. I think there probably was a degree of naivety, actually, in that, about how long it would take and how easy or not it is to basically get grid connections upgraded at some of these locations and to get the power there and the cost. And I think the landscape we're in today is completely different to the landscape we're in when that was first set. So the average of charges at motorway services, I think, is 8, but there are these locations that are very, very tough to get enough power to, and not at prohibitive cost. That is the challenge we face.
Right, Meg. Right. So is the fundamental problem the grid or planning?
It's the grid. It's the power. If you had the power at those locations, then they would have the charge points there now.
Shouldn't that have been thought about at the beginning before the commitment was made?
I think it's something absolutely, and as the report says, we have learnt about it. As Richard said, this was an ambition set to industry, setting out what we thought was the minimum. One of the things we have found most useful and what we have done as government is bringing together the charge point operators, Ofgem, the motorway service areas, organisations who haven't had to work together before, and what we can do to share best practice and look at how to make it as easy as possible where grid upgrades are needed to enable that to happen.
And can you define what availability of ultra-rapid charging point is?
In terms of how much it is available for use, or
how fast it's expected to charge a vehicle?
Do you want to do the definitions, Richard?
Typically, we talk about over 150 kilowatts as an ultra-rapid charger. The term's actually quite unhelpful, I have to say, for rapids, non-rapids and fast. It doesn't really, it's very confusing. It's better to think of sort of high power. And it used to be that anything above 50 kilowatts was called a rapid charger. No one really makes those anymore. They're being sort of phased out, replaced by these ones that charge at great power. And that means for certain cars and most new cars, you can charge at great speed. For the fastest charging cars, you can add up over 100 miles, maybe 150 miles in 15 minutes. It's getting much more like a petrol experience rather than having to sit by the side of the road for sort of 40 minutes or an hour. That's why ultra rapids are very much the way forward.
What happened? How far do you check whether the charging points that you're getting at the service stations actually do what it says on the tin in terms of the speed they charge at? I'm going to tell you why. I'll declare my interest as an owner of two electric vehicles. The incredible frustration when you get, this is an ultra-rapid charging point, and you get there and it doesn't. It does something like half the amount it's supposed to do. And you plan to go and have a cup of coffee and do a 15-minute stop, and you're there for 45 minutes.
The rate of charging depends on a couple of things. One is the capacity of the car to take charging. So some of them are capped at how much power, especially older EVs, about the power they can take. Some of them might be capped at sort of less than 100 kilowatts.
Yes.
The other point is, it's a bit like pouring water into a cup. So when you first start pouring, it goes in really quite quickly. And as you get near to the top, you have to slow down. So when we talk about the peak power, that doesn't mean it would be that power for the entire duration. It might be they do 150 kilowatts for a period of time, and then it'll come down to 50, 30, 20 towards the end. Not all cars are the same in terms of how they communicate with the chargers. So it depends on the charge point and the interface with the car and the capability of the car.
It depends on the power, because even when you've got these motorway service charging points, ultra-rapid ones apparently, the capacity of the grid isn't always sufficient, is it, to deliver what should be delivered at any one time?
It should be in those locations. I mean, there is a...
I'll tell you what, you go along and you find you've got probably 6 or 8 charging points, and you're there with a couple of cars and you're charging fine, and within 10 minutes a number of other cars come along and the charging rate drops. There is a problem with capacity.
Okay, so they're throttling down the charging because of the demand, which implies that there is a constraint on electricity supply at that location because there isn't enough power there. That can happen in certain locations. There's a question about, is it better to have the ability to charge for a large number of vehicles at a reasonable speed, or to have fewer vehicles charging at a very high speed? And they've obviously taken the decision to go for the latter.
So these ultra-rapid charging points that are supposed to be available at every motorway service station often aren't ultra-rapid, are they? That's the reality. I mean, do you do any checking of it? Yeah, or is it just something you say, they put them in, that's it, we're okay?
there is a huge body of the EV consumers are a very critical bunch, and they are reporting back.
That probably.
Yeah, they are reporting back to the charging operators about where this one's out of date, this one's not working, I didn't get anywhere near it. So that there is that live feedback, and when you get a network, its reputation of not delivering its quoted power or being unreliable, then that is something that they need to act on commercially, because those reputations are quite important now.
Right, and the ultra rapid or the rapid charging fund rather. Where are we up to with that? Is that going to be delivered now? We had a few problems with it, didn't we?
Do you want to start and then I'll kick off?
So, as with many of the other things we've been talking about, this is something where there has been more complexity. We're talking about, as you said, the grid connections, how we've been worked with the motorway service areas. So it has taken us more time than we wanted to. We are looking at it at the moment. We hope to have more news to share shortly. In the meantime, I think you can see, and as I said with the data from the 1st of January, there is good progress that has been made, and we have been able to work with other sort of public authorities, with Ofgem on their green recovery scheme, the work with National Highways on their battery pilot. So I think part of what we're learning is government money is not always going to be the answer to the problem here. A lot of what we can do is about breaking down the barriers to make it as sensible an investable proposition.
About 5 years and it hasn't started, has it?
No, the scheme isn't up and running yet. No, it has taken time.
5 years? Seems an awful long time.
5 years since the ambition was first announced. Richard, do you want to?
Well, I was going to say, when it was first conceived, it was a very different world. There was generally one motorway service area charger. There was a exclusive arrangement there. There was only 200,000 or so EVs on the UK's roads. There wasn't the absolute certainty on phase-out dates. Where we are today is completely different. There's much more appetite for private investment in charging infrastructure, particularly MSAs, are seen as like the sort of crown jewels of charging locations, because you've got this large throughput of people having to put a lot of electricity in their vehicles. You're seeing lots and lots of private investment coming in. Macquarie announced doing 650 chargers at motorway service areas, all private money. So everything has moved on, and also the rules around how you get a grid upgrades and who pays have also changed. When we first started working on the Rapid Charging Fund, we were in a world where we had an electricity system that was basically designed around managing down the cost of a stable system, whereas now we're talking about really expanding the electricity system to cope with electrifying transport generally and possibly heating other things as well. So the regulations and the structures in place for coping with those upgrades to the grid and funding them are now very different, and we've helped that work with Ofgem, thinking about how you pay for bigger connections and what portion of the costs gets socialised and how much has to be paid for by individual companies. So it's a very different landscape, which is why the original conception of how it's going to work is probably not how it's going to work in the future.
A couple of very quick follow-up questions from me, Mr. Bruce, if I may, on this issue of motorway charging stations. The NAA report, paragraph 12, page 10, makes it clear that you, as a department, have an ambition to have 100 of those motorway service stations, either rapid or ultra-rapid chargers by the end of this year. Is that correct? And is that going to be met?
Well, we rely on the information we get back from the motorway service areas themselves. I think the date for that, they are now forecasting...
by the summer.
By the summer. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I'm concerned about the 14 other ones that are not going to meet that target, because surely it would be a huge boost to EV users if you could say that every single motorway service station in this country had a rapid or ultra-rapid charging points in them.
I entirely agree with that last statement. Absolutely.
So what are you doing about those 14?
Well, we have to work with the motorway service areas. So part of the issue is their capability, their capacity and their appetite to put these things in place. We can't be forcing them to put in place investment, especially because the 14 are the ones that are very remote and will be a very expensive connection. So what we need to work with them and with Ofgem, with the local DNOs, the distribution network operator, about how to get electricity there in the most cost-effective way. They are the really tricky ones. But your statement about the offer and needing to get all of them to have a good provision, we entirely agree, and it's a matter of priority for us.
As I said, all but 4 expect to meet the 6 by the end of next year. So it is a sort of a dwindling number of the really difficult cases, but as Richard said, we totally agree with what it would be very good to be able to say to the driving public.
Thank you very much.
One follow-up, quick one. Why did you come to the figure of 6 being the required number? Because one of the other great frustrations, if you get there and find they're full, And that 10-minute, quarter of an hour cup of coffee becomes an hour and a half cup of coffee.
I mean, I wouldn't want to pretend there is a very scientific underpinning for the 6. It's what if we're all EV drivers, and it's what do you think you're an EV driver. It's if you knew there was a number at a location, where would you feel confident stopping? And it's definitely more than 1. Is it 6? I mean, we're looking at this now about what the best offer for the future is. It might be a much bigger number, and it depends on the location and what else is nearby. So it was very much a message to the MSAs saying, please think about this. You need to have a minimum provision which is good, and it's more than one rusting one which is out of order half the time. That was the idea.
So, order. I'm going to call a 5-minute break. It's 16:50 now. If we could all be back in our seats by 16:55, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Jim, please.
Thank you very much. It was just to pick up on the conversation earlier about being able to locate charging points. I wonder if any conversations have been had with both commercial developers and I guess local authorities and car manufacturers, especially sat-navs and in-house navigation systems, so that they're loaded into or preloaded into cars so that people can find them. And also the type of charging device. I've occasionally had it, not to whinge like Mr. Betts, but as an EV driver as well, sometimes you pull up at a charging point and the thing doesn't fit, or you've got to join a club and it's very frustrating. So what conversations have been had?
If I start, the committee, we were from the report we put through regulations in 2023, I think, to address some of these consumer issues, to make information available. So open data requirements came in from November last year. I think what we will expect to see, but we will watch in the market, is any number of companies looking to aggregate and provide that data as they do with other sort of transport information to make exactly that sort of information available. But Richard, do you want to talk about the conversations more generally?
Yeah, I mean, on one of the bits of information that will be in that open data list is the type of charge points, its power rating, all that sort of stuff. So we would expect to see, already, presumably you've used ZapMap, there is data out there that shows you where the charge points are, whether it's occupied at the moment, whether it's out of order, and that should become much more universal as this open data gets picked up by the providers. Much like bus information now, you can see you get apps like CityMap are picking up data about bus times and that sort of stuff. So there'll be third-party providers who scraping this data off charge point companies, and it should be made available to car companies as well. So
that was my question, is how is it provided? So a new one goes in, there'll be an external company scraping the information, feeding it back to the manufacturers who should upload it to the sat-nav. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Shanmugalingam, we've talked about planning, we've talked about grid connections. What are the other barriers to rolling out more charging points?
I'd say the other main thing, I don't know if Chair, what you want to come on to now, is making sure that charge points are accessible for everybody. There are different needs of people. You're aware through the report that we have established a new standard, a PAS standard about accessibility of charge points. We think it was the first in the world to be developed, but we were clear from the start that we would be learning whether that works, and so we committed immediately that we would be reviewing it. That is going on now with the British Standards Institute, because it's really important that all drivers are able to access the charge point network, and that is something we continue to see evolve, and we will want to be watching very closely.
Because Tesla were one of the earlier installers of specialist charging points, but they are only available for Tesla cars. Is it your aim in regulations that all new charging points should be universally available for all cars?
All of the data in the report is about publicly available charge points, so it excludes any closed networks provided by particular operators. The work I was mentioning was about how physically it is possible to access different charge points. It's not something we've mandated at the moment. It's a standard we have set out, and to see how the charge point industry are able to work with that, or if we need to make further changes.
But just on Tesla, a large number of their sites are now open access. They're available to other EV drivers as well. Not all of them, but a large number of them are.
Helpful, thank you. And in declaring an interest as a child surveyor and knowing how the grid works, of course, the grid, if you want a new grid connection, it can take years in some areas, and you will be competing with the government's other aim of producing more houses. So what conversations are you having with the grid that they've got to be flexible in providing your charging point providers with extra installations?
Yeah, if I start and then Richard will have more to add. The net zero transition generally, electrification of further sources of power, does mean that the government has committed to look at and work through Ofgem on how to speed up that grid connection process. There are sort of different elements of the transition. Most of the issues which affect charge point operators are about local connection to the distribution network, but obviously the overall capacity needs to be there in the transition network. I don't know whether...
No, that's fair. I think that we distinguish between like the high voltage connection and the low voltage one. A lot of the sort of day-to-day challenges on connecting EV charging is to the distribution network and being in a queue, as you say, alongside other local developments. I think what the charge point companies want is a very consistent approach from the the DNOs, the local distribution network operators, who are in charge of that process, which isn't always the case at the moment, to be honest. It's getting better, but you'll have different processes and different times it takes to get connections and to get quotes. There's also issues around standing charges. So there was an issue around whether people were aware of what the charge would be once they were connected, which is related to the size of the connection. So if you want a sort of future-proof location, you get a fat connection, but then your standing charge is commensurately high. So all that sort of stuff is being worked through. But we've got, in the long term, there'll be issues around the high voltage network, the ones on the pylons, getting enough power to key locations, especially those in remote areas, and to areas like Dover Port. We'll charge lots and lots of HGV trucks in the future. We'll need a lot of electricity to get to Dover. But in the short term, we're very focused on distribution. Anything to add to that, Nick?
Only that, yes, that what they described is entirely right. I think we have done very specifically a piece of work with charge point companies and the Energy Networks Association, who represent distribution network operators, around the specific grid connection challenges that charge point companies see. These are, again, as we talked about earlier, lots of interactions between bits of the world that haven't really done that before, and ever increasing as there are more and more charge points being connected. So that looked at things like, the kind of forms that need to be provided to get a grid connection. Are those suitable for this kind of connection? If you know that a grid connection is going to be really difficult in a location and cost a lot of money, what alternatives can a DNO provide to enable, either a smaller connection or a connection in a slightly different place, and just trying to avoid or trying to help those companies work together so that they're doing less and less of the back and forth unnecessarily, and that's more of a smoother process. And so we're working with kind of Ofgem on the implementation of that from now.
Thank you. Chris Kane, please.
Yeah, thank you. Can I move on to talk about the user experience of charge points and also improving that experience, and specifically in reference to the work that you've already done in this to identify some of the problems and to put in place regulations to address it, which is welcome. But now you've got them, how are you going to make sure that they are working as you intend them to do, and keep an eye on that?
If it's worth just explaining the regulations, because they've come into force in 3 tranches, which I think will affect what we're able to review and when. So first, the price transparency, as we talked about earlier, really important for consumers to be able to see on a consistent basis, and therefore drive their expectations. That came into force November 23. November 24, the open data requirements that Richard mentioned, contactless payment for rapid chargers, or existing rapid chargers, and all new chargers above 8 kilowatts, free 24/7 helplines, and then I think really importantly, going to the committee's interest, a requirement for 99% annual average reliability across a charge point operator's network, and that will be enforced by the Office of Product Safety and Standards. And then November next year, roaming at all public charge points. So although these were 2023 regulations, we obviously needed a period of time for the industry to be prepared for implementation. So we are just at the sort of foothills of seeing the impact, which we will keep under review, not least through the sort of public attitudes work that we do to monitor consumer sentiment, consumer concerns about electric vehicles.
How are you going to ensure that within that overall 99% upkeep, you're not going to get areas of poor reliability? How are you going to, 99% could be in one area, but there could be one area that's very, very badly affected. How are you going to make sure that from the whole network perspective, that there isn't local areas of poor reliability?
If I start, and I'm sure Richard will continue, so it's 99% for each charge point operator. There are some exemptions they can apply for planned maintenance, or if there was a flood in a particular area, which meant the charge points weren't available. I think it's fair to say we think that is going to be a pretty exacting standard. That means you couldn't have much variability across your network to meet it. But again, we will see the impact that it has.
Yeah, I haven't got a huge amount to add to that. I think the EV community, I think, will be quick to identify those networks that are falling below the standard on 99% and feeding that back to the OPSS. They're already creating systems in order for that to happen. So we'll be obviously monitoring it. We'll be monitoring the data, which have to be made open as well, and they'll be being held to account, I think, by the Court of Public Opinion to some extent.
Yeah, I was reading an email just to remind myself, just from one of my constituents in the village of Thornhill, Gemma, and what I got from the email is just how well informed there are. If you've got an EV car, you've got a level of knowledge of the problems and how they compare with other areas. So the users are going to be key to helping you develop the regulations. So what are you going to do to make sure you keep track of new consumer concerns that are going to emerge and change as we're all going on this journey together?
You able to talk about the behaviour research?
Yeah, I mean, we are. That's a very interesting question. I think what we're looking for, actually, just to sort of digress momentarily, is the early EV adopters. It was a bit of a sort of new frontier for people. They're very interested, excited in the technology, that sort of stuff. Actually, we want to get beyond that. We want the car as a car as a car. The fact that it's powered by electricity should actually be largely irrelevant. So we want them to not be nerds who are really, really interested, and actually just be someone who drives a car and can access energy when they want to access it. That's why those regulations are in place, to basically require that the things are working, that you can rock up and pay with a bank card. You don't need to join an app. You don't need to join a club. You don't need a smart card. You can just use it as if you were as close to a hydrocarbon experience as possible. But we are monitoring all the time sort of sentiment about EV adoption, and the EV adopters tend to be at least 90% of them will never go back to a combustion vehicle. That's what the research shows from a variety of different sources. What we're very interested and focused on, because it's worth remembering, this is about carbon and about driving decarbonisation of the transport sector, is the non-EV drivers, and giving them the most compelling offer from the EV infrastructure. So it's no longer a barrier to adoption. And that has started to tip down slightly, but it's still up there. People perceive it as a huge barrier to why they can't own an EV. And that's our sort of mission, to basically remove it as a barrier.
You've got, as you say, a very high standard of user, and they've got a high standard of expectations, which can be very useful at this stage, because we can iron out problems reasonably early in the technology journey. Any other ways that you're improving that experience? Anything you want to add? Just that gives us a sense of how making sure that you have a happy amount of drivers out there.
I think only the accessibility point that we talked about previously, and making sure that we're not making this exclusive for the able-bodied, and that there's a recognition that there'll be a variety of different people using this infrastructure, and trying to ensure that it's open and available to all, which is why we helped develop the standard. And through the Levi programme, are encouraging every local authority to think about who's going to access their charge points and whether a portion of them can be accessible and meet the standard.
Can I ask you just very specifically about slow chargers? How are you going to make sure that the reliability of slower charge points is maintained?
It's the same percentage, irrespective of the power.
So you'll address that at the same. Okay, and I think you sort of picked up just on drivers with disabilities.
Yeah.
Can I just get an assurance? You almost gave me there, but just to add to that, that you are embedding that accessibility, that no matter your disability, because it's not all one disability, it's multiple disabilities, and it can manifest itself in different ways. So you are embedding that accessibility challenge into the regulations and what you're doing.
So it's guidance we have published, or a standard we have developed with Motability and the British Standards Institute, and working with a number of groups. As I said, we think it's the first in the world. I'm not sure if we know yet whether others have followed suit. I think as the NAO identified, there are questions at the moment about how people know whether they've complied. There's one of the things we're learning. That's why we announced at the offset that we would be doing this review really very quickly after the introduction of the guidance, because it is so important. And as Richard said, asking local authorities to consider how they're taking into account accessibility in their Levi processes. Because the other side of it is making sure the vehicles are available for different people's needs, and hence the work through the ZEV mandate to give additional credits for the sale of wheelchair accessible vehicles, and not also to penalise hydrocarbon wheelchair accessible vehicles that are sold over the next few years while this transition is in place, because there are additional challenges for adapting some cars to meet the needs of all people, and we don't want to do anything which means that people don't have access to the vehicles that they need.
But just the last one on this, which is if you're looking at accessibility for people with wheelchairs, it's sometimes not just the charger itself, it's the area immediately surrounding the charger. So if you've got a charge point where somebody's reversed a van too close into it, or somebody's just put something in the road, but we all hear horrific stories of wheelchair users having experiences that we're just horrified by. So enforcing that, I think, probably needs an even clearer lens. So it's just that assurance that, yes, I'm unlikely to read in the story of a foreseeable problem that
I think
may
it's
end
something
up here in
we
our
are very
report.
focused on. Those physical attributes, curb height, are part of the standard, but it's something where I'm sure there's further work that we will need to do, but we start by reviewing the impact of the standard that we have in place already.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris Kane. Sarah Olney, please.
So just very quickly, we talked previously about the impact that VAT and the disparity of VAT will have on consumers depending on whether they're charging at home or in a public charge point. I just wondered, what will you be doing, Mr. Bruce, to monitor the different levels of charges being paid by different groups of chargers, I suppose?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, we do look quite regularly at the different prices charged for EV charging by network. And again, there's a whole load of consumer bodies out there gathering this data and looking at, and you've got league tables at the price of per kilowatt hour of charging. Typically, it's much more expensive to have rapid charging. On-street charging is less. And the issue for us actually is that 50 pence a kilowatt hour is sort of the threshold. If you're paying more than that, then you're largely probably paying more than you would pay for petrol or diesel. If you're paying less 50 pence a kilowatt hour, it's definitely cheaper. So if you're mixing and matching your charging...
Just to interrupt, but like over time, the comparison with petrol is going to fall away, I assume, is the goal, because you will want EVs to be, the default option. So the comparison with petrol is, over time, it's going to be the comparison between different ways of charging. And not every way of charging is going to be available to every consumer. There will be different groups, say, who will perhaps only be able to access public charging rather than at-home charging. So how will you model how the differential prices impact different groups?
It's an interesting question. So in the Levi arrangement we're putting in place, lots of local authorities correct me if I'm wrong here, Nick, are looking at the ability of charge point companies to change the prices without telling the local authorities. Some of them have revenue share arrangements as well. So the local authorities will have a very keen interest in those on-street charges, which is where most of the overnight charging for certain groups will take place, in what those price regimes are, whether they change rapidly over time, whether anyone's being exploited. And we'll be looking across the system as a whole, looking at the average rate, the average cost of charging network by network.
But not necessarily user group by user group. So, for example, somebody who's living in an apartment block in the middle, or even in my constituency, not exactly the middle of the city, but nevertheless a city location, will face a different, access to different types of charging than someone with a semi-detached home with a driveway. Will you be modelling how the costs, perhaps the average cost per year for those different sorts of people?
Yes, we model that now, just to reassure you.
Okay.
If one extreme, you'll do all your charging overnight on a driveway. The other extreme, you do all your charging on the public network, rapid charging, and they are very different. And in between, there's different mixes of how you get energy into your vehicle. Do you do, on peak?
Do you accept that different demographic groups are going to be overrepresented in those different...
Potentially, yes. I mean, just to be clear, just as the regional distribution of charging infrastructure is definitely an issue today, but will probably change over time, the different offer you face, depending on whether you have off-street parking or don't, is a challenge. It's probably the biggest single challenge to the EV transition in the UK, because you can't have a situation where a certain portion of society has much, much cheaper mobility than another portion of society, and we're very, very aware of that.
And so are you monitoring it?
Yes.
And you're monitoring it by sort of demographic group rather than... You tell me that you're monitoring what the different networks are offering.
And by...
Are you monitoring how different groups of people are impacted?
I'm not explicitly, I don't I think, people who haven't got off-street parking will be charging publicly. And
do you accept that there are certain demographic groups who are much less likely to have off-street
parking? What we haven't done is made the leap. In this group will be, these demographics. We haven't made that leap, but you certainly could, and we could do that in the future.
Yeah, you could do that in the future.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we're looking at when we're looking at the guidance on gullies as well was that precise point around the level of income versus the level of off-street parking, and there is the relationship you expect there. So we have looked at it in those scenarios.
Currently, if you've got a petrol car, regardless of what kind of house you live in, the petrol will cost the same. Petrol doesn't cost the same in every place, but everyone who goes to that particular petrol station will be paying the same. But in the future, you'll have quite a big price differential depending on what kind of home you live in. So my first question was, are you monitoring that? And then my second question was going to be, what will you do about it? But I'm not sure that you're monitoring it.
I would say more generally it goes back to the issues of competition we have talked about before, and you'll see the Competition and Markets Authority, just as they've been very focused on the retail fuel supply for a number of years, are already very focused on charge point operations, particularly at motorway service areas, and it is one of the reasons why we've taken our time with the Rapid Charging Fund to make sure, as I said earlier, these are markets which are set up for the long term in the best interests of consumers. And so there is a role for us in making sure these are competitive markets, that where the forces of competition make prices lowest as possible for all consumers, and the best offer for consumers.
So I think the competition will potentially lower prices of certain types of charging, but if you can't access that charging and you're stuck on that higher charging model, pricing model for charging rather, then the competition won't make any difference?
Well, yeah, you're right. Competition can reduce costs in respective
that
categories.
segment of charging.
Yes, and about choices. As Nick said, the work we are doing on gullies and making sure that more people, albeit not necessarily in Richmond, but where there are communities where people can reliably park outside their house, that will mean that people can access home charging tariffs safely for people using footways, because obviously we're concerned to make sure there aren't trip hazards and other issues that you looked at in your local roads maintenance inquiry.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Alnath. Thank you. Ms. Shanmugalingam, can I just sweep up on a couple of areas? I make no apology for coming back to the grid, because your whole of this subject is dependent on the grid. And can I take you to page 32 of the report and paragraphs 20 or 2.26, 2.27, 2.28. 2.26 makes the pretty stark comment that the government recognises the process to receive electricity grid connections is no longer fit for purpose. So there is clearly a big problem with the grid. Paragraph 2.28 says in 2023, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and Ofgem put in place a connections plan. So I presume and would hope that your department is feeding into that.
Yeah, I would say the first thing I'd say, and then Richard and Nick will be more expert on the specifics, is the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles is a joint unit between the Department for Transport and the Department for Energy Security Net Zero for exactly these reasons, because what we are doing is making the electricity and the transport systems sort of completely interconnected. And so I think since the very beginning, or for a decade, this has been a joint unit. Richard, if you want to talk
so
more
I mean,
about
my counterpart from DESNZ regularly, and we talk about the role of transport electrification, how it shouldn't be forgotten. So although I think a lot of the focus in DESNZ has been on the transmission network, on the sort of 14-year tail to get a new connection from a solar farm or a wind farm, what we're always saying is, yes, but we need to focus on the short-term distribution connections, which are actually really important, and we need to get those sort of sorted and get that timescale shrunk in order to be able to meet our enormously taxing carbon budgets requirements. So we do talk to them regularly. We are very plugged in, no pun intended, to those to that work, and we have done our own work specifically, which Nick talked about previously.
So I hear the ambition, and I agree with the ambition, but actually the paragraph 2.28 says a new connection of processes to be planned to be implemented by 2025. It goes on to say, and further improvements will be made through the reviewing their connections process. To date, there have been improvements in the rate at which connections are made, but connections queue is still growing. So back to my point earlier, you're competing with housing development, you're competing with solar farms, all these other people that need grid connections. And yet you will not be able to roll out your programme fully, particularly these new service stations, unless you can get these grid connections. And clearly, if it's to be done in time, these grid connections need to be a year or two rather than many years, as takes place at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this is we accept this as a full government challenge, and given the role of transport and road transport in particular in carbon emissions, this is something we are doing for the whole of government, not sort of just from a transport point of view. So it's something where we continue officially and politically to work very closely with DESNZ about how it is a very difficult issue. There are big challenges here. as Richard said earlier, electric vehicles will also offer opportunity to the grid in terms of balancing and reducing potentially peak requirements through having this distributed network of batteries connected through smart connections. But it's a challenge we will work very closely with FDSNS for I think years to come. And there are barriers we will need to work together on year by year to make this work as well as possible.
So now I understand that the government has written to all permanent secretaries, which presumably you are included in this, as to how they could cut out bureaucracy in their own departments. So can I take you to figure 9 on page 33 and ask you about 2 specific items on that page? And this is to do with traffic regulation orders. And dedicated parking bays for electric vehicles require a traffic regulation order. And that table tells us that the DFT is introducing a digital system with a standardised process which will reduce the application time to a couple of weeks. How are you getting on with that?
Nick, are you able to update?
So I think it's in beta testing. So a number of local authorities are already on the platform. I think I haven't got data in front of me in terms of when it's heading towards full rollout, but it's being tested with a significant number of local authorities at the moment.
Because, it shouldn't take too long. Going on to that table, it says DFT is also carrying out a review to remove the need for traffic regulation order for charge points, though this could take till 2026 to implement. I'm not quite sure why it needs to take 2 years to implement a fairly simple change like that.
So I think there are kind of future decisions for ministers in that position. Removing the need for traffic regulation orders is taking away some opportunities that a local authority might have to make a decision. In that regard, not all EV charge points in local areas, in different bits of the local area, there might be a need for a particular EV bay or not, and the desire to have one or not depends on the level of parking provision. It depends on, if you are trying to put chargers on the street, you want to put it in front of someone's house. If someone always parks in front of the house and they haven't got an EV, they might be, I'm not having a charger in front of my house with a parking bay which says I can never park in front of it again because I'm never going to get one. So local authorities are dealing with those kind of challenges, and so the TROs they can be a useful tool.
Well, with great respect, Mr. Shaw, if MHCLG can do it on planning and permitted developments, which is exactly the same arguments, why can't you do it on road traffic orders?
So I think there are future decisions to be made on that. I think the work we've done on planning we're really pleased with, and that will have a great impact. There will be any number of kind of barriers we come across as we build up at a greater level of these, and traffic regulation orders is on that list.
And if I may, the changes that I mentioned earlier, I'll sort of directly address other of these points in this right-hand column. So the streetworks process and extending permitted development rights, and we're really pleased to have been able to make progress on that since the NAO published this report.
Great. Unless committee members got any other questions, can I thank you, Ms. Shanmugalingam? Sorry, I'm a little bit tongue-tied on your name. I do apologise for that. And your fellow witnesses very much. It's been an interesting session. We will be publishing an uncorrected version of the transcript in the next few days, and our report will follow in the next few weeks. Thank you again. Order.